The United Nations warns the Russia-Ukraine conflict could soon lead to a global food crisis. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Russia and Ukraine have been called the world's breadbasket, top exporters of, among other things, wheat, maize, corn and barley. But as the conflict in Ukraine continues, the world has been hit with commodity shortages and skyrocketing prices. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres warns of a looming global food crisis.
The war in Ukraine is now adding a frightening new dimension to this picture of global hunger. Russia's invasion of its neighbor has effectively ended its food exports. Price increases of up to 30% for staple foods threaten people in countries across Africa and the Middle East, including Cameroon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan and Yemen.
In the Turkish capital, Ankara, Turkish and Russian officials failed to reach agreement on a bid to unblock grain exports from Ukraine, while both sides voiced support for a safe corridor in the Black Sea. No concrete steps were announced. CGTN's Michal Bardavid has more in this report.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was in Ankara together with a military delegation for 2 days of intense talks with Turkish officials. One of the main topics on the agenda here in Ankara was finding a solution for the safe passage of shipments from Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. Millions of tons of grains have been stuck in Ukrainian ports due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey has been in talks with Russian, Ukrainian and UN officials on establishing an observation mechanism that would be controlled by the United Nations and monitored by Kiev and Moscow.
We are ready to ensure the safety of ships that leave Ukrainian ports and go to the straits. We are ready to do this in cooperation with our Turkish colleagues.
In his statement, Lavrov also denied that Moscow was responsible for the current global food crisis and shifted the blame onto Western sanctions. On that matter, he received some support from his Turkish counterpart. The World Food Programme accuses Russia of not only blockading Ukraine's ports, but stealing grain after satellite images showed it loading grain onto ships in ports it has occupied. Grain shortages threaten to push some countries in Africa into crises, and Chad on Wednesday declared a food emergency. Turkey gave its assessment of the situation.
If we need to open up the international market to Ukrainian grain, sunflower or sunflower oil, we see the removal of obstacles standing in the way of Russia's exports as a legitimate demand.
Lavrov claimed that in order to resume shipments, the only necessary step was for Ukraine to either demine ports or mark out safe corridors. He also assured that Moscow would not take advantage of the situation to advance its military operation. However, shortly after, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry spokesman dismissed Lavrov's promises and tweeted that these were empty words. Lavrov and Çavuşoğlu also discussed regional issues such as the Syrian and Libyan conflict during their talks. Michal, Bardavid, CGTN, Ankara.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Vladimir Golstein heads the Slavic Studies department at Brown University. Mirette Mabrouk is a senior fellow and the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Egypt program. Also with us is Simon Ateba. He is the chief White House correspondent for Today News Africa. And Michael Hodge is an international food security and development analyst. He served as North Africa regional director for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Michael Hodge, Ukrainian officials are telling us that their storage capacity is now full. That's 30 million tons of grain in silos in Ukraine. They have warned that if this continues, that grain could rot. And we know that Ukraine and Russia are responsible for something like a third of the world's supply of wheat. So where are we likely to see the greatest impact from this conflict on food supplies?
Good evening, Anand. Good to be with you. As you said it, the Ukrainians have been saying that they have 30 million tons of cereals ready to export. These cereals are mainly corn, because they are very afraid to export their grains, other grains like wheat, which is a staple food for their population. So for them, the food crisis had started in Ukraine, and many in Ukraine are facing food insecurity. As for the rest of the world, the countries that are dependent on importing their food supplies from Ukraine and Russia are mainly in Africa and the Middle East, and they are struggling to find other sources to source their food supplies, which is becoming increasingly difficult when you see that countries like India, for instance, has decided to limit its exports of its wheat production for fear of a prolonged conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
Michael, are we in uncharted territory here? I mean, you've worked at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. How different is this crisis, or how similar is it from previous food crises?
Arnon, this crisis could not have come at a worse time. The global economy has been struggling to come out of the pandemic crisis. The economies had started to pick up steam. However, prices continued to grow because of supply chain issues. You add to it a conflict where you have two of the major food exporters in the world, and the access to that food supply being in jeopardy. That creates an environment where many vulnerable countries will be facing volatility and shock.
Simon Ateba, good to have you with us. The conflict and the sanctions against Russia, that has led to sharp rises in prices, especially the prices of food, cooking oil, fertilizer, and energy, gas and petroleum. The African Development Bank is warning of a 20% decline in food production and a 300% increase in the cost of fertilizer. And as our reporter just told us, Chad has declared a food emergency. What can we expect in Africa?
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this show and trying to show how the war in Ukraine is likely to impact Africa the most. It's a case of a bad situation gone worse. It's almost like going from frying pan to fire. Africa was already facing many crises. We know the conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region has left millions of people facing an increased risk of famine. We have conflict in West Africa with Boko Haram displacing millions of people from their farms. And then we now have the war in Ukraine, and not even to talk about the drought in East Africa, where you have a new report by Oxfam says a person dies from hunger in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia every 48 minutes. So when you add the war in Ukraine to the multiple crises, including the climate crisis, you realize that it's a bad situation gone worse for Africa.
So, Simon, as you say, a number of factors that have exacerbated the situation in many countries in Africa. But I want to get back to a point that Michael Hodge mentioned a moment ago, and that is looking for alternative sources of food. How difficult is that for the countries of Africa? Because, as Michael told us, a country like India, which actually produces grains, they're keeping that grain for themselves. Simon?
Yes. So I didn't actually know that you were talking to me. So yes, exactly. And it's not just that. It's not just that the countries that have enough food, like India, are afraid of a prolonged war in Ukraine that may affect them. So they are trying to conserve and preserve what they have. But we also have the fact that Africa has been facing famine for a long time. I think the reason this is a big issue is because I believe some people may disagree with me. I believe because the conflict in Ukraine has destabilized Europe and has created instability in Europe with gas prices, inflation, and now everyone cares. But Africa has been facing severe famine for decades. For instance, in 2011, we know that more than 300 million people died in East Africa during the drought there. And this time we have the driest season in East Africa, and people are dying. So in Africa, we know that it is not just the war in Ukraine. It has to do with multiple issues, including the climate crisis, the instability, and even, quite honestly, the inequality that is affecting the African continent.
Mirette, great to have you with us as well. As we just heard in that report from Ankara, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been holding a meeting with his Turkish counterpart. The point of that meeting was to try to break the logjam that we're seeing right now over Ukrainian wheat exports. This is what Lavrov had to say. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
The share of this Ukrainian grain we are talking about is less than 1% of global production of wheat and other grains. Hence, the current situation with Ukrainian grain has nothing to do with the food crisis. When and if Ukraine clears mines and allows the ships to leave its ports, we are not going to take advantage of this situation in the interests of special military operation. Let me say this again. There were never any obstacles from our side in solving this problem. A small problem, really.
So, Mirette, Sergei Lavrov there having a very different view of this crisis. What do you make of what he had to say?
Yes, so I'm not sure which global food supplies he's talking about, because as far as the Middle East is concerned, I mean, let alone Africa, which Simon just described in detail, as far as the Middle East is concerned, this is a small, steadily screaming nightmare. To start off with, so Egypt, for example, is the world's largest grain importer, and it gets about 50%, about 9 million tons a year, and about 50% of that comes in from Russia and 30% of it comes in from Ukraine. And Ukraine, to the best of my understanding, is about the world's 5th largest exporter of wheat. So it's quite significant. So when this started happening, I think Egypt had attempted to stockpile, and it had said that it had stockpiles for about 9 months, but it doesn't appear to be the case. Egypt just put out another tender from any of the 22 countries that it used to import from. And the wheat imports that come into Egypt are linked to a bread subsidy system, which is vital to the country's well-being, because over 2/3 of the country are linked to that bread subsidy system. The Egyptian government is currently trying to pull in wheat from its own local production, but that isn't going to be enough. And what they're super worried about, what everyone in the region is worried about, is that this lack of supply is going to lead to increasing food insecurity, which may lead to political and domestic insecurity.
Right, you were talking a moment ago about this being a nightmare and talking about instability, security problems as well. I mean, how do you see this manifest itself if it continues?
Well, it tends to be fairly simple in the sense that populations will put up with a lot, but if you can't feed your children, then you start complaining, and if the complaints aren't enough, then you start making a fuss. And there's really nowhere to go after that. So for most of the countries that are, I mean, with the exception of the Gulf countries, many countries in the Middle East have populations that are struggling with poverty. In most cases, Egypt is better off than most, but 30% of the population, 29.6% to be precise, is already below the poverty line there. And bread, for example, makes the difference between starving and not starving. So, and bread is actually peculiarly linked to domestic stability in Egypt, and that the only time they got serious riots was, apart from the Arab Spring, was in 1977 during what were called the bread riots, right, when they tried to raise prices.
Vladimir Golstein, Ukraine has accused Russia of stealing its grain, and Europe is also accusing Russia of using food and the supply of grain as a weapon. Here is the president of the European Council, Charles Michal. Let's listen.
The Kremlin is using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war are spilling over across the globe, and this is driving up food prices, pushing people into poverty and destabilizing entire regions. And Russia is solely responsible for this food crisis. Millions of tons of grain and wheat stuck in containers and ships because of Russian warships in the Black Sea and because of Russia's attack on transport infrastructure.
So, Vladimir, tough words there from the President of the European Council, Charles Michel. He is placing the blame firmly at the door of Russia.
Well, there is nothing new about that. Ever since the beginning of the war, we hear the barrage of accusations against Russia. Some of them prove to be correct, some of them prove to be totally made up. But, this is like a, war continuation of that by other means, by propaganda. So Russians, now they have mass murder, now they have mass rape, now they're trying to starve everyone. So this is kind of, and what is very disturbing about it, it looks like all these officials, EU, NATO officials, sometimes UN people, it looks like they are reading from the same book. Just now, okay, let's accuse in food shortage. If you look at the numbers, if you look at statistics, if you look at the history of the region, we've heard it on this show, there are a lot of multiple reasons for that. A, there was tough situation in Africa before that. B, we have commodity prices. We have a real crisis produced by the war. What's happened is if we want to blame someone, we have to blame the war, and we have to blame the way it's conducted. Once again, the Ukrainians export this grain through Odessa. They mined it. Russians, in their turn, blockade it. Now they want to have access to this area, and so this is a concrete thing. But we have to be really well aware of a multiplicity of causes, and the world have to try to solve them together. What we see nowadays is the so-called butterfly effect. Everything is connected. Mm-hmm. The war in Eastern Europe affects Africa. So there should be a mutual effort. We've heard about the climate, the same thing.
Right.
Russia have to be involved. Rather than ostracizing and putting sanctions on Russia, which produce more crisis, more inflation. So this is a complicated issue, and blaming what Michel did is actually looks very silly.
Okay, the thing is, Vladimir, that the world is facing a food crisis, a looming food crisis. We've just heard from the Ukrainians. They say that those assurances that were given to them by Sergei Lavrov are empty. Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow would not take advantage of the situation if exports were allowed through the Black Sea. Now, the Kremlin is also saying that sanctions against Russia need to be lifted. Have we got to something of a stalemate here?
Absolutely, and I think this is, we have to look at this, comprehensively, because, don't forget that Russia now does get certain, medications from Europe. They don't get supplements, so Russian people are suffering. People in eastern Ukraine, which were, the subject, the bone of contention there, were shelled, living in the basement for 8 years. So there is nothing new here. So and if we allow Ukraine and Russia exchange accusations without really making them sit, and there is no attempt to make Zelensky and Putin to sit together and negotiate, because immediately Zelensky said, no, back off. Russians will not back off. So this is the reality. They took particular part of contention land, and they're going to stay there. So until the world does realize that there's going to be accusations, and people in distant land like Africa or Egypt will suffer from all this.
Michael Hodge, part of the problem we have heard is the availability of fertilizer, which could actually extend the food crisis for many more years because it will affect future harvests. This is what Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say. He says the United States and the United Kingdom are to blame. Let's listen.
The situation will worsen because the British and Americans have imposed sanctions on our fertilizers. This means that the plans on the harvest will be much more modest and prices will only grow further. It's absolutely short-sighted, erroneous, and I can say, just dumb policy.
So, Michael, there we have the Russian president calling it dumb policy. I mean, there's a bit of a blame game going on here. We've heard that.
Well, we have seen examples of food diplomacy at its worst, starting with the talks in Turkey today to statements like you've just quoted. I think that we are in a food crisis right now that is on its way to becoming a long-term crisis that is going to lead to famine in many countries if we don't address it now. Agriculture is not a desktop exercise. If farmers in Ukraine, for instance, right now, are not able to have safe access to their fields, if they don't have safe access to the inputs like fertilizers, like seeds, and the ability to tend to their fields in order to secure that the next harvest will be collected, and hopefully by then we'll have secured a safe passage for the export of their harvests. The problem today is we are getting sucked into a chicken and egg exercise. Why are we having bad access to the ports to the Black Sea? Is it because a war started there was an aggression, or because people defending it and they put and closed it down? I think we need an immediate cessation to hostilities, and we need to have an international fora to bring parties to the table and to adhere to international law against the use of food as a weapon during war in order to solve the problem. We need to have secure access for the food supplies to go to people within Ukraine, within Russia, as well as to the rest of the world.
Simon, I was looking at some figures on the situation on the continent of Africa. As many as 25 African countries, including many of the least developed countries, import more than a third of their wheat from the two countries. And in fact, the director of the Horn International Studies Institute for Strategic Studies says, given the pressing need, African countries don't really care where their food comes from, but they need to import food. Do African countries have something of a collective diplomatic clout that they could use against the warring parties in this to get them to recognize that this is going to have far-reaching consequences around the globe?
Yes, exactly. You were talking about fertilizers in the previous question. When I speak with African leaders and speak with African people, including farmers, one of their biggest problems is access to fertilizers and insecurity in Africa. And I know that the Nigerian president last March inaugurated a $2.5 billion fertilizers farm for fertilizers. I don't know when Nigeria and African countries will be able to benefit from that. So right now, Africa is a bit divided. As you know, many countries are behind the US in the push against Russia. And there are also several African nations that realize that it's really hard to go against Russia when almost half of the countries in Africa rely, depend on wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And so one will think that the international community will focus on trying to find a solution to the conflict rather than try to almost exacerbate it. And so while all that is going on, Africa is suffering. Millions of people who were already facing multiple crises, from the COVID-19 economic turmoil to the climate crisis, to the conflict, war, instabilities, now have to deal with the fact that shipping disruption on the Black Sea and the fact that they can't get access to it from Ukraine and from Russia.
Mirette, there was something of an alarming report from the World Bank which said that we could see high food and energy prices for the next 3 years. So it doesn't appear to be a short-term solution. I mean, even if Russia and Ukraine come to the negotiating table tomorrow and they come to some kind of diplomatic solution, this is not going to end. And what kind of impact is that going to have, especially on the countries in the Middle East? We're talking 3 years here.
So I think it's a matter of degrees. I think if somebody, if various nations get together and try and find a solution to this war sooner rather than later, then that is going to mitigate the effects, the knock-on effects that we're going to see. Because while food and energy prices, are going to continue to rise. The question is how much. And the problem is, of course, that this conflict came on the end of the pandemic. So even countries with reasonably healthy economies that have structural reform issues are straining at the seams. So it really is just sort of a knock-on effect, and it's just going to get worse. If this war continues to drag on, then inflation is going to continue to rise, energy prices are going to continue to rise, food will continue to become scarce, and you're likely to get a worsening of the domestic situation in all of these countries.
Vladimir, what is your view on that? I mean, as Mirette just told us, we're likely to get a worsening situation in many countries. And if we look at the situation in Ukraine right now, much of its infrastructure and that infrastructure that supports the exports of its grains have been destroyed. If we look at the ports and railway lines, much of it has been damaged. Ukraine, of course, is also protecting its own supplies of grain. So what do you see as the long-term impact?
From what I read, we have to differentiate between, this current moment and long term. Long term, as your speakers said, if the war continues, harvesting would become more difficult. Russia would produce much less. Ukraine would produce much less. So if we're talking about this particular year, Russians keep on saying there is a way of exporting grain through Romania or through Belarus and so on. So that particular situation, it's kind of the accusations are made up primarily by Ukrainian leadership to open up this blockade of Odessa. But in the long term, there's a very serious issue. Because as everybody acknowledges, the prices will go through the roof because Russia cannot, would be able to export to Europe, other places, their, fuel and so on, and fertilizers. So we're dealing with a serious issue, and until the whole world sort of somehow make this, war go away, it will exacerbate already very, very serious problems all over the world.
Michael, very quickly, I've only got about 30 seconds left. Do you see any kind of a focus on this crisis, on the food crisis? Because, if you look at the war that's going on right now, I mean, attention seems to be focused on what is happening on the ground there and on the number of casualties there, but not on this food crisis.
Absolutely, Anand. And I think people need to understand that even when we talk about large quantities of food that is being produced here and there, we need to understand that people don't eat at the global level, don't eat at the national level, people eat at the household level. And food security is about having access to food. So if the price of food is going up, then the purchasing power of poor and vulnerable people is diminished. So we need to employ every effort now, including in international fora, in order to put in safety measures to support economies in need, especially when you have populations that are facing now or about to face famine.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.